Good morning. Welcome to Memorial Road. As Scott mentioned, my name is Brian Plum. I'm a college minister here. I'm thankful to be with you this morning. I'm going to start off with a happy Father's Day to all the dads out there. Really special day. I also know that it's a really difficult day for some people, and so we want you to know our thoughts and prayers are with you today, as we know it can be a difficult day as well. I always tell people who come here that Memorial Road, from a dad perspective, it's really a great place to be because you can see a lot of great examples of dads. And so I'm really thankful for all the examples of good fathers here that we have. Dads have a lot of stereotypes that go with them. Turns out we do a lot of the same things. We have a lot of things in the dad base, if you will. Dad, you can use that later if you want to. I want to share a few of them with you, and dads, if you're willing, just maybe kind of admit these. Some of them, you just got to be honest with yourself. If not, maybe your spouse or your kids can kind of say, "Hey, Dad, that's you." Here's a few of them. Shows up to the airport 5 hours early. You don't know what traffic's going to look like. You don't know what security line's going to be. We got to get there. I want to see the gate. I want to see it. Don't stop on road trips unless it's for gas. If you've got to go inside to use the restroom or get a snack, you've got exactly 16 gallons to get it done. I love this one. Saying they just let anyone in here when they see a rival dad at a restaurant. Probably Chili's. This next one, man, it's a tough one for me. It's almost need a little therapy. Me and my dad had some moments here, but gets irritated at kids because they can't hold the flashlight right. It's out working on the car, only to be trumped by when he sends you to get a crescent wrench and you bring like a handsaw back and you're like, "I don't know, Dad." That's the only moment that trumps it. Refuses to use the GPS. That's kind of everybody though, right? But Dad's they're like, "No, turn left here. Turn left here." This next one, if you're a young dad, if you're not doing this, you need to get on board. Clicking the grill tongs together. Clicking the grill tongs. I don't know what it is, but it's something about it that we love to do. Lingers over the service guy. You just kind of hang out with the service guy. You don't really know anything about electrician, but you're like, "Yep, do that. Yep, you're perfect. You're doing that right." Just kind of stand there. Wearing white and blue New Balance shoes, or the all whites. Depends on which generation you're from. And this is maybe my favorite one, saying, "I'm just resting my eyes." I'm just resting my eyes. It's a classic one. My wife and I went to the mall a couple years ago, and I'd seen the whole mall like 3 times, and I went to her, she'd been in like 2 stores. And I said, "I'm going to go to these couches over here." And I fell asleep on the couch for about an hour. And it wasn't like, "I hope you don't see me sleep." It was like, "I'm going to sleep right here." And that's what dads do. That's what dads do. I hope today you guys get to rest your eyes a little bit. There's a lot of stereotypes that come with dads. And maybe for some, not all, maybe for some, it's that dads love sports. Dads love sports. I think a lot of people love sports. It's in our culture. It's who we are. And we do this series on idolatry and we think about sports. It is a big part of what we have to think about. And just to kind of prove my point, I want to give you a quick little sports trivia here. I'm gonna give you a movie quote, sports movie quote, and you're going to try to guess the movie. This first one's theological. Is this heaven? What movie is it? Yeah, it's Field of Dreams. It's Field of Dreams. John Kinsella says it. Shoeless Joe Jackson said it before him, in which Ray says, "No, it's Iowa," and then later in the movie he says it's heaven. And I don't know what it is about this movie, but guys, no one can explain it to me. It's a weird movie, but you love it, and it's like a great spiritual moment for you. This next one, there's no crying in baseball. Yeah, a league of their own. This next one's easy. Wax on, wax off. The Karate Kid. Yo, Adrian. You know that one? It's Rocky. Several Rocky movies. It's the land before time of sports movies. So many of them. One of my favorite movies, this next one, Attitude Reflects Leadership, Captain. Remember it? Remember the Titans? Julius Campbell, Gary Bertier getting a little argument there. I won't read all this next one to you. I'll give you a hint. Notre Dame, and he says, you're 5 foot nothing, 100 nothing, and not one speck of athletic ability. Man, you want to make me cry. Show me this Rudy movie. It's such a good movie. Couple more. You're killing me, Smalls. That one's easy. Yeah, the great Hambino says that in there. This next one's a little tougher. It's a little tougher. I play, coach stays, he goes, I go. Hoosiers. Jimmy says that. And this last one, maybe the best line of the whole movie, I don't play defense. It's from Space Jam. Bill Murray rolls that at us. Sports is in our culture. It's who we are, and it's just a part of our culture in a lot of ways. And Phil asked me to preach this sermon. He actually came to me and said, Brian, you're the most athletic person I've ever met in my whole life. And will you preach this sermon? Something like that. And I actually said to him, I said, what's the date? I said, I can preach that day. I said, what else you got? I said, that's a tough one. I said, that's hard for me. I said, what else do you have? And he told me all these other ones he's been preached on. I was like, no, I'll take sports. I can do that. But it is hard. It's been hard thinking about it because I do love sports. I love sports. I played sports growing up. My kids are in sports now. I went to 4 games yesterday. I went to 1 Friday. It's kind of what my family is a part of. And we love sports. But so it's been a tough one to think about. But as we approach it, I know there's also, as a wide crowd, there's people who are like, man, I don't love sports. I don't want to hear it. But I know that God's word will speak to you still. And really, as we think about idolatry, it has a lot to do with all the things we've talked about. And then I know I've got other people who are like me, and they saw the image, and they're like, oh, man, here we go. Great. You're like, don't say one thing about golf, because I'm trying to golf today. And you're thinking about it, right? Because you love sports. You love sports. And it's Little League, it's golf, it's fantasy football, it's all the things. It's a part of who we are. And it's hard to think about. It's difficult to think about when you think about it alongside this, because you're like, I just really enjoy it, but we have to take a look at it. Even Paul says physical exercise is of some good. Sports are good. Sports are a good thing. Sports bring us character moments. They bring us goals and allow us to figure out how we achieve those goals. They give us discipline, which we talk about a lot in this arena too. They give us a lot of things. They teach us how to deal with conflict with one another. They teach us how to be a good sport. Sports are good. I remember when 9/11 happened. I remember, you're probably like me, it was very much those few days after you're kind of going, man, are we going to recover from this attack? And everything about our world seems so off then. And then I remember this moment that President Bush threw out the first pitch at the Yankees game. And I remember thinking to myself, we're going to be okay. Because it brought a lot of healing to our world. If you go to the 9/11 museum, there's a whole area just about sports and how it helped us recover, helped us heal, it helped us realize that we could get back to who we once were. The sports are a good thing. A few weeks ago, Phil shared one definition with us. I want to look at a couple of them as we think about idolatry, as we think about what is it that defines this word that we've been talking about. And he shared one from Timothy Keller. It says this, it's anything more important to you than God, which I'm like, in that part, I'm like, that's easy. Like, that's nothing more important to me than God. And then the second part kind of gives you the measuring stick for it. Anything that absorbs your heart and imagination more than God. Anything you seek to give you what only God can give you. Whatever your heart clings to and relies upon is for ultimate security, that is your God. Bill said that. I'm going to share a couple things from Bill this morning. If you think about, what does my heart cling to? What really matters to me? One more. The idol is whatever claims the loyalty that belongs to God alone. And you think about it, and you begin to sit in it, and you go, okay, man, you think about these modern day, these everyday idols that you and I deal with. And many of them have the same thought in mind. They have many similarities because it's the same struggle. We have an obsession with something, and that's what our struggle is. It's hard. Sports, although they're really good, and I like them a lot, sometimes they bring some different things to the table that are hard. Sports in our culture, they give us a false sense of identity sometimes. Either that's with our team, and that's like, man, that's who we are, that's who I am. Or maybe it's some sport you played. I recently talked to a friend of mine who was a very good Division I athlete, even got to close to the professional level. And it was time to hang it up. It was time to be done. And he said to me, he said, man, I literally, I don't know who I am. He was in tears. I don't know who I am. I'm trying to figure out who I am, because they had put so much identity in that it was hard. And we create our identity by lots of things like that, but again, it's kind of the balance of all the things. Sports take more and more of our time, our energy, and our money. It takes a lot of our time. It takes a lot of space. It changes our emotions and often decides what our week will look like. I remember losses from my teams, right? You do too. You watch them and you're like, well, there goes the week. We lost. There goes the whole season, actually, right? A friend of mine, I love OU. A friend of mine went to a few OU games, the travel games. He would go to them. And 2 or 3 years in a row, we lost one. And the first year, I was like, hey, maybe you shouldn't go to the game. I was kind of joking. And the second or third year, I was like, bro, seriously, don't go to any more games. I'm not kidding. I'm not joking about this. Changes our emotions. Changes who we are. Sports in our culture, sometimes there's an unhealthy balance in kids' sports. If you don't start young and train young, you will get behind. There's some truth to that statement. But we have to find the balance in it. A friend of mine sent this to me. He saw in a dugout where he was coaching just reminders from our kids. I'm a kid. It's just a game. My coach is a volunteer. The umpires are humans. And there's no scholarships today. We have to kind of take a step back sometimes. We have to think about it. As good as they are, we have to step back and think. It pushes out other great moments of family and faith. I know that I would say I have a lot of great moments in sports, even with my family, but I've got to think about it as far as time margins go. I've got to be pushing out some other things that could take place. It makes the focal point of being the best, and that kind of creates a tension when we think about Christ's message. Philippians 2 said Christ became nothing. John 13, he talks about he came to serve. He talks about the first and last, right? And so it creates a tension in the message that we hear from sports. And I don't think it's saying don't be competitive. I think mostly it's saying as believers, how do we look at this? How do we think about it? Author and preacher David Platt, he writes about sports, and he talks about 2 ceremonies. And I want to share it with you. I want to read it to you. Quite honestly, when I first heard it, I was like, well, that's really annoying, actually, because it kind of stings a little bit. But he creates 2 ceremonies. He says, pretend for a moment that you live in another country, one completely foreign to this, and you have an opportunity one fall to spend a week in Oklahoma City. I changed it up a little. So you come on a Sunday morning, you observe many people, maybe even most, slowly rising to make their way to a building they call church. They groggily approach the building for some sort of ceremony. Clearly, whatever happens at the beginning of the ceremony is not that important, because most people don't come until after it's started. I'm not looking at anybody. I'm not talking to you. You watch them file in. They begin to mouth the words to songs, many of them almost expressionless, virtually emotionless, after which they sit down and passively listen to someone talk to them for a period of time. And you notice people start getting a bit fidgety, uneasy at the time of the ceremony, looking at their watches. The end approaches. It's finally over, and they quickly walk out. But as you walk with them, you listen to them, and you hear many of them talking with one another about something that happened the previous day. They smile and they laugh as they recount another ceremony they've been to, apparently a bit more interesting than this one. You see what I mean? It's so frustrating hearing this. It's really frustrating. In fact, the rest of the week, that's almost all you hear people talking about, is the coming Saturday ceremony. Here, the people who were at the Sunday ceremony are strangely silent about what they heard. They're very enthusiastic about the Saturday. They can't seem to get here soon enough. So as your curiosity is piqued, you begin to eagerly anticipate the coming Saturday ceremony with them. The Saturday comes. You see people wake up. They leave their houses dressed in some sort of outfit. Many of them look the same that they love to wear for these types of days. They drive out of the city, some north, some south, where they gather together on what they call hallowed grounds for the Saturday ceremony. They get there early for this ceremony, way early, where they eat, drink, laugh, and play, not just with their family and friends, this part's kind of funny, but with complete strangers. You've never seen community like this. And when the time comes, tens of thousands of them enter a shrine together. You can't think of another word to describe it, where they raise their voices with passion and they applaud some sort of assembly of children when they play a game in a field. And the game begins, and they chant and sing until they virtually lose their voices with far more passion than the other ceremony. For sure, people aren't looking at their watches. In fact, they're excited when it goes into a thing they call overtime. It's exciting for them. They're celebrating, and it turns out there's millions more gathered around movie screens watching at home. If you were the visitor that came from another country, and you came to this city on a week during the fall, which one would you identify as their religion? I heard that, and I was like, man, come on. I'm trying to watch a game this Saturday, right? It's difficult to hear, but that's what it is. As believers, it's not saying it's all bad. It's not saying you can't watch sports. Don't sell your jersey just yet. But it's saying we have to kind of take a step back. As it was with money and with power, we have to take a step back and go, what's my obsession with this? How much is it a part of my life? Do I have some balance as I think about it? And in reading and thinking about this, I discovered, you really start thinking about it and reading some scriptures, you realize God is pretty serious about idolatry. He says in 2 of the 10, he makes his point, make sure that nothing's before me. He says in Exodus 20, you shall have no other gods before me. He says later on, you shall not make for yourself an image in the form of anything in heaven above or on earth beneath or in the waters below. You shall not bow down to them or worship them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing the children for the sin of their parents to the 3rd and 4th generation of those who hate me, but showing love to 1,000 generations of those who love me and keep my commandments. Deuteronomy, he rolls through several. And starting in chapter 7, carved images are to be cast in the fire. Deuteronomy 8, if you serve other gods, you will perish. Deuteronomy 12, the difference between a prophet and a false prophet is, do they lead you to worship other gods? Cursed be the man who carves or casts an image. You start thinking about this, you're like, okay, God is serious about this idea of idolatry. And Bill, in his book, he presents this idea. What people revere, they resemble, either for ruin or restoration. What people revere, what they just love, they start to look like it, they resemble it, and it's either for ruin or restoration. And it's interesting to think about. I think the easier illustration than sports is like if you think about money, you sort of become kind of greedy when you obsess over it. But with sports, it's kind of about image. It's kind of about being first. It's kind of about yourself. And again, it creates a tension with Christ's message. It's hard to think about. As you think about Israel and the golden calf, and you remember the storyline of Moses. He's been gone for so long, and the people come to Aaron and they go, you got to give us something to worship. And so Aaron does. And later on in Exodus 32, it presents some different thoughts about the people. I remember when I was a kid, I grew up in rural Oklahoma. I was in algebra class. This is really weird, by the way. And my principal comes and gets me and 3 or 4 guys. He says, fellas, come with me real quick. And he pulls us out the hallway. And he says, hey, the Gadarians down the street, some of their cattle got out. I want you to run down there and help them get them back in. This happened actually 3 or 4 times. It gives you a little glimpse of my childhood. I wasn't very good at algebra, but the cattle, I kind of do some of it. And so I go down there, and I don't know if you've ever messed with a cow, but cows are hard to move. I passed up a dad joke there. I'm going to leave it alone. But cows are hard to move, and you get to around them, and they're really difficult animals. That's why people watch rodeos, right? It's because you want to see how out of control an animal is, or this cow is. Well, it's kind of interesting in the text because they start to use language that describes the people of Israel as the same as the calf. It says Israel is stiff-necked. They want to do what they want to do. It says they're out of control. Hosea describes Israel as a stubborn cow. What people revere, what they worship, what they revere, they resemble either for ruin or restoration. And we know the story, it was for ruin. They began to focus on something that was not God. And there's some other examples of the Bible that you begin to obsess over something and you begin to look like that thing. In Jeremiah, it says they pursued what was worthless and became worthless. They pursued vanity and they became vain. They walked with emptiness and they ended up empty. You think about the story of creation. When Adam's allegiance shifts from God to serpent, he starts mirroring Satan. When Lot's wife looks back for her ultimate security, she ends up looking like the cities she adored. We resemble what we revere. Phil shared a few weeks ago this Psalms 115. There's a few things like that in that chapter, particularly verse 8. It says, let the people who made these idols and all who trust in them become just like them. When we obsess over things, our obsession with sports, it can cause us to be so caught in being first that Jesus' example was not focused on. It's not about your image. It's not about that. It's not about your team. It's not about your score. But as believers, we kind of have to step back and go, what's my life centered on? What am I obsessed with? Even Jesus had some language that applies here. He said, a disciple, when fully trained, will look like his or her teacher. They'll look like him. David Foster Wallace says, in the day-to-day trenches of adult life, there's actually no such thing as atheism. There is no such thing as not worshiping. Everybody worships. The only choice we get is what we want to worship. You think about Christ's message, and he's saying, hey, if you're a disciple of mine, you will worship me. That's what your choice will be above all things. Kind of a simple thought, but man, the obsession is hard, right? The idolatry is the tough part. Read a story the other day of a man who went to see a dental hygienist. He begins to look at this poster on the wall while they're out of the room and comes back in. He says, hey, where do you think my gums are along this spectrum? She says, well, they're actually kind of bad. And he says, well, they don't feel bad. They feel fine. And the dental hygienist says, well, that's the genius of gum disease. It doesn't hurt badly until it's too late. And so it is the same with idolatry. We don't feel the hurt until the harm has already happened. You're already in a place where you go, man, I'm already in a bad spot here. It kind of happens that way. This is a picture of Steph Curry. He is the greatest NBA shooter. He's the greatest basketball shooter of all time. He just won his 4th championship this week. And just to watch him is it's just unreal to watch him. But I read in the off season, he will shoot 500 to 1,000 shots per day. And you think about the discipline of that. You think of showing up with that. And I know. Like his dad played in the NBA, and he's a really athletic person. But you think about the discipline of 500 to 1,000 shots a day. And that's kind of what we get caught in with sports. We begin to think about, I've got to get my reps in, or my team's got to do well, or my golf swing. When you come look at my golf swing and tell me where I'm off just a little bit, right? We become obsessed with the sport of it. But the discipline of it applies to following Christ as well. As I think about things, you think about, I've got to get my kid to this sports camp. It's the same here. You got to get them to the church camp. You've got to get your reps in this spot. And you've got to get your reps in God's Word. And your conversations have to be centered around the Messiah in some way. What's it look like when our allegiance, when what we revere is Christ? What happens as we pledge our allegiance to a crucified Messiah who calls us to lay down our own lives? What happens when we put in the reps of our faith? The same thing happens. Our faith grows. Jesus calls us to that. We talk about discipline all the time. We find areas to grow in our faith. It's a pretty tough conversation, right? You're like, man, this is hard. It kind of makes you feel off a little bit. I'll tell you what, I think we still do. I think we still play sports. I think God gave us sports. I think a lot of good things come from them. I think we still watch them. We still talk about them. We're still excited about your team. We still have your kids play sports. You still develop them. But maybe there's some moments where we can think about how we do it differently. And I think it starts with maybe we have to admit that we have a little bit of a problem. Maybe we have to kind of acknowledge, and again, applies to sports, but it kind of applies to a lot of things. We might have to admit we have a problem. We might have to ask if our guilt is something about God's Spirit and conviction. What if it's about being convicted? What if the feeling you have is not just simply like, man, this is making me feel guilty, but it's God's Spirit going, but what if you and I spent some time together? What if we got some reps in? We might have to let people know who we are. You might have to decide what your priorities are as you think about life. You might have to evaluate your time, your energy, your passion, your money. You might have to change the lens that you look at sports as a whole. You might have to evaluate some things. You might have to ask the question, when I play sports, when I watch sports, when I'm about that, does my faith show up in those moments? I could talk to you for hours about how faith is in sports. The most recent one I heard, the national champion OU softball women, their theme for the year was talking about getting out of the boat from Peter. It happens all the time. There's a lot of faith that takes place in sports, but you kind of got to ask that question. Do we have a faith life aside from sports? Do we have a community in church life? There's a lot of great things that we have to find the balance of it. And maybe we have to look at it through just a different lens. As hard as it is to talk about, as hard as it is for me to think about, maybe we have to look at it with a different lens. Maybe it's through Matthew, and we look at this verse, but seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be given to you as well. Maybe you have to think through that lens. Can I tell you a story real quick? Can I brag for just a minute? I mean, since I got a microphone and you're just sitting here, can I just brag on myself for just a second? When I was growing up, I loved to play basketball. And we had this really cool court, and it was our gravel driveway, and then about at the free throw line, it was dirt, but it was almost like concrete because we played all the time. And me and my brother had driven a stake at the free throw line, and we had created this little irrigation system to where it would drain so we could play right after it rained because we didn't want to miss any time. And my dad put this big floodlight out. We could play till all hours of the night. And man, I'll tell you, I had a few nights there. I was kind of a backyard legend on my court. I had a few nights, not a ton, but a few nights where it was like, give me the ball early and often, and it was pretty remarkable. You should have seen it. You know what was frustrating? I could never ever get it to translate when it mattered in an actual game. I'll prove it to you. Not in a quarter or a game. I was 0 for 1, not in a quarter or a game, but my sophomore year I was 0 for 1. And that was my basketball career. Jay Chapman, who goes here, some of you may know him, he went back to my high school recently and he called me. He says, Brian, I'm looking through the trophy case. I can't find your name anywhere. He said, I found your wife Shannon's name all over the place because she was really good. And I was like, thanks for calling, Jay. I appreciate that. I don't tell you about my backyard legend moments to brag. I actually tell you that just to make this point. Sometimes I'm worried that I don't show up in the right places. This Francis Chan quote actually sums it up well. Our greatest fear should not be of failure, but of succeeding at things in life that don't really matter. Of succeeding in the backyard moments, but never really making it work when it comes to faith and life. But succeeding at that and thinking about it that way. Paul talks about running a race, and maybe we have to think about to ourselves, am I running the right race? Am I running this right race, or am I running a different one that's not going to lead me anywhere? I told you, Paul said, for physical training is of some value, and I didn't finish the verse. I tricked you. He says, but godliness, he keeps going, has value for all things, holding promise for both this life and the life to come. And maybe you and I just have to think about it through a different lens. It's tough to talk about as I love sports, and I love thinking about it, I love watching them, and I love playing them. But as I think about being a believer, I do have to step back and think about, okay, how do I approach my faith and life? And what's my balance of all of it when I think about my time and my energy and my conversations? Maybe I can cut some time. Maybe I can listen to just 3 podcasts about the Thunder Draft this week, and maybe I can spend some time in some eternal things. But it's hard to think about. As you go about this week, I challenge you just to dwell in this idea, in this series of asking yourself, what's my idol? What do I have to think about? Am I running the right race? If you have some need this morning, come now as we stand and as we sing.